started out looking at our ecosystem from the perspective of looking at any ecosystem in the natural world, which would examine, say, a pond or a wetland with ecological tools of life history, or we do an assessment, a dynamic assessment, life dynamic assessment of that particular ecosystem. And so what we've been doing this morning, very, very, very briefly, of course, is examining our ecosystem with some of those same tools, looking at our life history and some of our dynamics through a particular lens. And the lens that we're using today are the 5 principles in ecology. The first one, everything runs on energy, which was why we wanted to look at our energy systems, see what our energy was doing a little bit, where there's emotions or energy attached to particular emotions. And that's, of course, something you can take with you and continue to think about and work on is, your feedback loops, your energy, not just what gives you energy, because we're pretty clued into that, but those places that we're not as adept at knowing, or we're not as aware or certainly conscious of, and that's, how we misplace our energy or misuse our energy, give our energy away, abuse our own energy. So those are things to reflect and contemplate on too, and the idea would be the same with how that happens in any other ecosystem in the natural world. Then we moved into diversity and what that means for our ecosystem, where we can cultivate diversity or where we lack psychological diversity. In other words, a narrowness in thinking. One approach, one way of perceiving things. So reducing the opportunity would be a lack of diversity, and that would certainly be psychological. It can be emotional. If you don't allow yourself to feel something in particular, and that, of course, is a big one, depending on the culture and how that is expressed. It's not always culturally appropriate to express how you're feeling. It may be okay to articulate what you're thinking, but not so much how you're feeling. So that's something to keep exploring with yourself as well. And can you catch yourself when you stop a feeling from happening, and cut that off, because that again reduces your diversity, and it reduces the full expression of who you are. And remember, we use the images of the geyser, the flamenco dancer, to look at force and expression, and how do we, how do we perceive our own sense of force, and how do we understand how we express things. So that kind of was where we were this morning, and the idea of that diversity really urges us to question who we are in our particular roles. And there's certainly going to be things there that you haven't thought of before. What are the particular attributes or qualities associated with your roles in your home, in your family, in your work? Feel free to join us. And of course, query yourself on who you are as a global citizen. And of course, this week we're, I think, engaged in the conversation and certainly that inner questioning of who am I as a conservationist. But it might behoove us to broaden that out to who are we as global citizens. Okay. So, any questions on the morning with energy and diversity, or anything that I've talked about or that has come up before I jump to waste? Okay. So we'll start then with our third principle, that there's no waste in the natural world, but lots of waste in human practices and behavior. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So we know there's no waste in the natural world. I love this image. The nature restores, reuses, recycles, composts everything. It's just a natural process that happens. These are ecosystemic properties. It happens in every ecosystem. And the images from these processes offer us ways to imagine how we might begin to think about transforming our potential psychological waste into something much more fertile for our psyche, for our life. Now, the waste section is an extensive section, not so extensive as it is intense, which is why I wanted to wait until after lunch to jump in that on an empty stomach could be wasteful. So, but it's a bit heavy because when considering waste in ecopsychology, when we study waste, we go into difficult areas of looking at our greed, envy, jealousy, shame, and guilt. And when that's not enough, then we look at predatory behaviors and parasitic behaviors. So, I'm going to choose something a little bit lighter to work with here today. For lots of reasons, it wouldn't be appropriate to dive into deeper material until we know each other better, and there's a much more of a sense of trust there. But just so that you know, it's an area that goes into what I call these dreaded emotions, shame, guilt, envy, jealousy, greed. And they're very actually important because they do drive, as you all know, a lot of our conservation practices and behaviors. And they drive behaviors and practices that aren't conservation-minded, which of course is a big problem. But what I'll focus on today is just one example around the sense of waste, and that's disturbances. So we'll talk about disturbances. And disturbances in the natural world are a part of what happens in nature, whether it's windstorm, firestorm, avalanches, even tsunamis. Now, of course, our activities have exacerbated many of these, but these are natural processes that happen in nature. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for us psychologically? What does disturbances mean for us psychologically? Disturbances such as these that we see in the natural world, these nature's movements, if you will, certainly can cause damage to an ecosystem. They can destroy an entire ecosystem. They can kill off organisms that reside in those ecosystems, or they can turn over an entire ecosystem to where something completely new emerges in that particular area. So when something dies off or gets destroyed by nature's movements, then it opens up opportunities sometimes for something else to come in. Opportunities for an entirely new organism perhaps to emerge. And some species can only exist when there's disturbances. These extremophiles that we find in the natural world that live in extreme conditions and require disturbances, and that's kind of interesting to look at ecopsychologically too. Where are we extremophiles? And we won't have time to go in that today, but it's a very interesting question. Where do we create extreme conditions in our life? And you probably all know people who tend to lean toward the more dramatic way of living, and so there needs to always be a sense of drama around that individual or those individuals, and when there's not, they'll create it. So in a sense, that's sort of an extremophile type of individual. But we also have places in us that we can be extreme. I can be, a real loner sometimes, and that can be perceived, that would be perceived sometimes by friends or family as, a bit of an extremophile. But I also know that I need alone time to rejuvenate. And so I'm sure after this conference, I'll be in total isolation for a while. So disturbances, for example, if we think of what happens when there's a wildfire. Wildfire sweeps through an area, leaves nothing behind except a charred or burned area, burn zone, a dead zone. It appears as a wasteland. Now, listen to me metaphorically as we go through this. It appears as a wasteland. There's no life, or there's not even potential for life. But ecologically, something interesting, ecologically, new life is struggling in these zones. We just may not see it. It's either in the soil, predominantly in the soil, something coming up from below. So new life struggles and eventually springs up, and that particular habitat is restored. In this we've seen in forest lands, we've certainly seen in some of our areas in California that have undergone so many fires. In 1 year we lost so much of Santa Barbara, and in the next year it come back after the rains. In some areas take a long time to come back. You all know this as conservationists. Our bleached coral systems take a long time, if ever, to come back. But what I want to work here is with metaphor. The system before the fire operated with a set of principles. Maybe it flourished, maybe there was a lot of growth, a lot of life, a lot of organisms in that particular system. But once the fire swept through, it transformed that system. It changed it. It was not the same after the fire. And I don't mean just, of course it wasn't the same because it was burned. I mean, a lot of things may have changed in that particular habitat that we just do not see organismically. Maybe one species or plant or insect was taking over that particular habitat and we didn't see it, we didn't know it. And when the fire came, it righted that situation because it destroyed everything. Maybe there was another organism that was trying to emerge in that particular ecosystem that we couldn't see as well. And of course the fire came through, swept everything off that ecosystem, and then something new emerges from that. So that nothing is wasted, even after that disturbance. And this is the metaphor I want to work with for a few minutes. And I'm using wildfire, but you may have one in your mind if you've gone through a hurricane or a tsunami or an earthquake. So whatever image is working for you. The idea then is that our human ecosystem also needs disturbances at times. But it's not like we're going to say, okay, I wake up this morning, I hope an earthquake hits my life. Oh, I need a tsunami in my life today because I can't seem to make change myself. We certainly don't think that. We certainly don't ask that. And always remember what you ask for. Sometimes you get it, so always be careful with our words around that. But the idea being that many times we undergo a huge disturbance. At the time, our life is turned upside down, it's broken apart, it's burned to pieces, it's shattered, whatever the metaphor, the image is. And then it's only later on, as you start to piece your life back together again, that you realize, this was positive. I needed this to be able to do this, and this. Very hard to understand when you haven't gone through that, but I imagine everyone through this had an experience of a psychological turning over. So in nature, in the natural world, things are composted. They're restored, recycled, reused. Every bit of burnt ash in that particular fire is going to be composted into the soil and restored and used for the next ecosystem. The metaphor works for us as well too. Composting is another great image in ecopsychology that I use a lot. As you know, composting is a breaking down, decomposing, rotting, stinking process. When we take our backyard clippings or our food sources and we put them in our compost bin, it's not exactly we want to sit by that and have tea in the afternoon. It's a very rotting, stinking, dying process. But it's a transformative process. There is a transformative process happening in that compost bin. Psychologically, when we go through a disturbance, we are also going through a composting, transforming process. A dying off of old patterns, perhaps that we couldn't change on our own. It was only with a huge disturbance in our life that we were able to change some patterns. For example, you're in, and these are examples students have shared with me, but I thought they were pretty profound. You're in a relationship, you're in a marriage, you've got a child, you don't want to break the marriage up, you don't want to leave it, so you continue on in a passionless or even sort of a lifeless relationship. Then Hurricane Andrew hits. And everyone's world is turned upside down. And in the aftermath of that, people's lives, you start to assess things very differently. And so the relationship ends so that both people can continue on and find a way for their own ecosystem to flourish rather than staying in a relationship where both are actually deteriorating. We have examples of that all the time in our lives. These are very, very difficult times. So recycling in nature or in the natural world, when things are recycled in this transformative process, they break this organic matter down into a fine humus. A fine humus that we know goes back into a garden or under our trees or whatever we want to use that for, because it's a fertilizer. It's a very rich, nutritious soil that we use for new growth. Our psychological composting process looks and smells very similar to a composting process in the natural world. It is a breaking down, a decomposing, a rotting, stinking, dying off of old patterns, old behaviors, old belief systems that no longer serve us. They're not helping us mature, but are preventing us actually from maturing or growing. It's a breaking down of old narratives or stories that are holding in place disruptive or even destructive behaviors. A breaking down into a transformative process that can create potentially a wiser human. And of course the word human and humus are etymologically related. There's a beautiful story about that I can share with you afterwards if we have time. But the idea then is that we can compost some of these very, very difficult times in our life in the same way. If we can use that image, we can use that metaphor. Something comes up, it's a crisis, you're not sure how to deal with it. Okay, what's being activated? What's serving the situation? What's hindering the situation? That might need to be composted. So your image is, okay, that goes to the compost bin. That behavior did not serve me today. It actually made the situation worse. Staying in this relationship is not allowing anybody's ecosystem to flourish. It's causing them all to break down. The relationship needs to go into the compost bin. So it's a way of working with the metaphor. So in the sense that our life stinks sometimes, and we use that language, hey, how's it going today? Oh, my life stinks. My students use other adjectives that I won't necessarily share with you because I'm sure you've all heard of, but they're very true. What we say coming out of the psyche is really potentially what is going on underneath the surface. So for our exercises around this particular session, in this particular section, I want you to think about what might a disturbance look like in your life. Maybe you got it right already. You know exactly, hey, I just went through a tsunami, I just went through an earthquake, I just lost a good friend, I just had a broken relationship, I just went through a divorce, an untimely death of someone, a child, a friend, a spouse, a beloved pet, family member. A friendship that abruptly ended can also be a disturbance in our life. A serious injury or an illness that changes our lifestyle forever can be a disturbance in our life. So can you recall what your disturbance was in your life, and what did that look like to you? Did it feel like an earthquake? Did it feel like a fire? Did it feel like an avalanche, a tsunami? Did it just come out of nowhere instantly? Or did you see it coming over a long period of time, but boy, when it hit, it was nothing like you thought? Give me a few minutes on that. So what might a disturbance look like, or has it looked like in your life? And you may have all had the experience before too, of someone coming up to you, or when you're sharing a conversation with someone and they say, oh yeah, that was wasted. I wasted time in that relationship. Oh, that was a wasted job. Oh, that was a wasted degree. Well, I had a wasted childhood. I wasted time in, working 20 years for this corporation. Look what happened. So we've all heard that, or at least I imagine that we've heard that at one point in time, and maybe we've even actually felt that we've wasted time or effort in something. But what I want to try to get to today is how that might not have been waste. It might have been a disturbance that psychologically you needed because it produced something about yourself that you didn't know before that actually was requiring your attention. Waste feels horrible, you know that. Psychologically, waste can appear as a depression, suicidal impulse, despair, grief, anger, hatred, guilt, some of the things we talked about with diversity, lack of diversity, violence of all kinds to people, animals, and planet. And with waste, psychologically, we can hit a tipping point with waste.